Hi, thank you so much for joining me in another podcast. This is Gary Zacharias. It's the Apologist bookshelf. I'm going back for a third look at a book by Clay Jones. We've had him come to our church, excellent speaker, terrific individual. He's got a book, he's got several really good ones. This one's called Immortal and subtitled How the Fear of Death Drives Us and What We Can Do About It. Sean McDowell says it's insightful, it's well-researched, it's convicting. He says the book is a game changer, and I agree with that. The older I get, the more I realize what's going on when I look around, how people try to get away from the idea of death and what they do instead to try to take their minds off it. And so I've covered chapters in his book that deal with these different projects that people have come up with in a desperate attempt to avoid thinking about or dealing with the concept of death. So I want to do another chapter here. It's chapter 5. It's titled The Failure of All Secular Salvations. And so what Jones says here, he said, we try all these strategies to try to somehow feel that we're going to conquer death. He said they fail miserably. And so what happens, he said, people resort to unreal or wasteful or unhealthy, destructive, and even sometimes deadly measures to end that pain because they can't end it by these secular ways. He said he's talked to his wife that he doesn't know how people can get through life without Jesus. But he said, well, yeah, they do. He said, that's why I wrote this book. And he said there are two key things they'll do, denial and distraction. He said, you can hear people, they'll say things, non-religious people will say things like, oh, I know mom's looking down on me, talking about the death of a mom, or dad's with me, or my wife is proud of me. And yeah, I went to a memorial service a while back, and that's the kind of language that was there. He quotes a sociologist that says, reason can't free us from the shame of death. It can only try a cover-up, and it does. He says, since the discovery of death, human societies have kept designing elaborate subterfuges, hoping that they would be allowed to forget about the scandal. Failing that, they forbade speaking of it. Yeah, exactly right. There's that futurist, Ray Kurzweil. He said, death is such a profoundly sad, lonely feeling that I really can't bear it. So then he adds cheerfully, this is Kurzweil again, so I go back to thinking about how I'm not going to die. Yeah, I wonder how that's working out for him. But he said, denial is good. You can say no, 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 and plug your ears and go la, la, la. But he said that doesn't do much without distraction. Just telling yourself that you're not going to die, that's not possible. That doesn't work. So he said, he's got another author who says, people tranquilize themselves with the trivial so they can lead normal lives. Isn't that a great line? People tranquilize themselves with the trivial. So people get real busy, they have careers, they have kids, chores, all these things, and there's certainly nothing wrong with those things, but they're often used to keep thoughts about death at bay. I think that's right. He said we can distract ourselves in so many ways. The carpe diem, grab for all the gusto, go like crazy, seize the day. They have their secular salvation strategies. They have bucket lists. That allows you to keep busy, doesn't it? To live it up until you don't live at all anymore. You only live once. And Clay Jones says, when I hear that, I think, yeah, but we can live forever. He said, but the problem with all these ways of denying and distracting, he says, those things lead to dissipation. You're squandering. He says, we end up wasting our resources in a variety of ways. And so this is the heart of this chapter, and I want to go through these because I think they're really powerful. So what do we do that because of the fear of death, what do we do instead? And how do they fail? So he said one way is workaholism. And he gives examples of people like Anderson Cooper, his really a sad background for him. When he was 10, his father died during surgery. His older brother committed suicide, and said he got really busy trying to keep the fear of death away from him. And many people say, well, is it a bad thing being a workaholic? Well, he said it's socially acceptable these days. And I thought it was interesting. He said when you're being interviewed for a job and they ask you what you consider to be your biggest weakness, the joke answer is, well, people say I'm a workaholic, but I don't think that's so bad. He says workaholics are famous for ignoring their families. He said work is important, but you don't want to do that and ignore other truly important things in your life. So one way that people work like crazy, distraction and denial, is work like mad. Number two, he says another way that people deal with this is amusement. So he says we get our minds off the seriousness of the human condition by being amused. One person who was involved with the Marvel Cinematic Universe said, I fell in love with the notion of movies being a thing that can help us escape. Yeah. He said, you think about successful entertainers and the kind of money they make as athletes and actors and singers. Why? Because they help us what we need most, and that's to escape the thoughts of death. He says, here's an example. The Nielsen Corporation, that does all sorts of ratings and stuff, reported on average people spend about 10.5 hours interacting with media each day. Wow. He said there's nothing wrong with watching television, but he said not that we shouldn't do those things at all, but he said, yeah, watch a movie, a sporting event, or interact on social media, but people that are most, he's quoting another person here, people that are most useful for the kingdom of God are those who spend the least amount of time doing what doesn't matter. So number two, dead end is amusement. The third thing people will do is sexual addiction. That gets to be huge. Fantasy escape, right? So they're watching something, but he said the catch is fantasy escape sometimes leads to real world. Fantasy leads to the real world. So you get affairs, divorces, molestations. He said it's very well known that resorting to sexual fantasy damages the possible of a real life, mature, loving, and healthy sexual relationship with the opposite sex. As he says, no one looks barely 18 for long. Wow. And he said, these things of denial and distraction, he said it keeps you from thinking about death, but they're going to fail. And he said these denials and distractions that we have like this are always being popped by suffering. Yeah, so you hear things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or wine, women, and song. Let's party. Paul mentions this in 1 Corinthians 15. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But he prefaces it with, if the dead are not raised, but the dead will rise, thankfully to Jesus Christ. What's another problem that people get into because of this failure of these secular salvation options? Meaninglessness. It's hard, if not impossible, to find any meaning in life. And I've seen that as a teacher. I've had students tell me, what's the point in life? It says, but if you Google around, you'll find atheists will tell you, create your own meaning. But Jones says, well, how important is the creation of my own meaning if it's nothing more than something I concocted on a Sunday afternoon? Yeah, exactly right. Here's another problem area people can get into because of these failures of all these other secular ways to deal with death. Number 5, anxiety. One psychiatrist said this, despite the staunchest, most venerable defenses, we can never completely subdue death anxiety. It's always there, lurking in some hidden ravine of the mind. Then he quotes Jordan Peterson. We all know about Jordan Peterson. He said, I've often treated people with anxiety, and people wonder practically, individually, clinically, why are people anxious? And Peterson says, and I think that's a completely ridiculous question. The reasons for anxiety are starkly self-evident. What I wonder is, why aren't people terrified out of their skulls so badly every second of their life that they can't even move? He said, yeah, we have an anxiety. He said, Peterson didn't specifically mention the fear of death would drive that society, but he thinks that's part of it. So he said, if you sit there at night, staring, and you're awake, and you're looking up at the ceiling, we all realize our projects fail. But he says the great news is that eternal life awaits. Well, not for the people who have turned off Christianity. Here's another problem that people run into, the failure of their secular salvations, depression. Yeah, depression, no kidding. Jones had a blog at one time, and he pointed out in that blog that there are things other than the fear of death that depress us. It could be hormonal imbalance, but the prospect of our death and the death of people we love, that's the major reason for depression. He says only one thing is going to prevent you from watching everyone you love and everyone you know die from murder or disease or accident. And what's going to be the only thing that will prevent us from watching that? It'll be your own death from murder, an accident, or disease. It says, unless you have a robust belief you're going to live forever with your Christian loved ones, how can you admit the truth about death and not be depressed? Yeah, exactly right. He quotes Bertrand Russell, who said, now he doesn't believe in God. So Russell said we have to build our lives on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Well, that's not exactly encouraging. So, yeah, I think he's making a good point. He also says, I'm not arguing that people's fear of death explains all mental illnesses, but he said many psychologists say people's fear of death does play a huge role. So we've got this area of depression, huge area of depression. Here's another area that people, because of the failure of secular salvation, is where it leads people, psychosis. One person, who's a psychiatrist, said people have psychotic breaks when repression no longer works, when the forward momentum of activity is no longer possible. So that reality of death smacks people so hard in the face, and their immortality projects have failed. They see no way to transcend their death. Then they may get crushed by it, and they may actually fly into some other, some other reality, some other realm, and they end up with psychotic episodes here. Here's another problem that people get into because of the failure of secular salvations. Where they turn next, or where could they turn? Drugs. So many people numb their fears through alcohol and drugs. So we know that, and I don't think there's a reason to spend much time on that. He said the misuse of alcohol and drugs leads to heartache and crime, to illness and premature death. So getting high is not going to handle the problem of death and the fear of death. Suicide. There's another way that people have come to the end of their rope, realizing that secular salvation has not worked. The rate of suicide in the U.S. increased nearly 30% from 1999 to 2016. He said in 2016 alone, I didn't know this. This is pretty astounding. I'd like you to think about this for a second. How many Americans took their own lives, do you think, in 2016? 5,000? 10,000? No. The statistics say 45,000 Americans took their own lives in just 1 year. And Jones says for many of these, the fear of death is so severe and so unrelenting, they just bail out of their own lives. I've had a couple of students suggest suicide, and it scared me to death, and I took them to get some counseling as soon as possible. He also mentions that depression is a serious problem in the atheist community, and it's led to suicide. In fact, there's a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry that says religiously unaffiliated subjects had many more lifetime suicide attempts and more first-degree relatives who committed suicide than subjects who endorsed a religious affiliation. Subjects who had no religious affiliation perceived fewer reasons for living. Well, that's not surprising, isn't it? How sad is that? Here's another thing that comes about because of the failure of these secular salvations. This is number 10, anarchy. He says, as people cast off God and they don't think there's an afterlife or we're going to be judged, you get anarchy and societies collapse. I mean, all you have to do is look at some of these communist countries who don't think there's a God. And you look at the terrible death rate and the slaughter that took place. You look at Pol Pot and Cambodia and other places like that. Martin Luther, back in the 1400s, late 1400s, says, if you believe in no future life, I would not give a mushroom for your God. Do then as you like. For if no God, so no devil, no hell. So it says, plunge into treachery, rascality, robbery, and murder. Yeah, he got it right. Here's a more modern version of that. Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov said, if God and immortality do not exist, then man is allowed to become a man-god, and then everything is permitted. And it's that last part that chills you, doesn't it? Everything is permitted. You have nobody out there that is going to watch and going to judge you. You're on your own, so do what you want. Here's a person, who's a French Chateaubriand, said there can be no mortality if there be no future state. I'm sorry, there can be no morality if there can be no future state. So without God, you don't have morality. Solzhenitsyn picked up on this. He said, he's the Russian dissident, If I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, he's talking about the Russian Revolution, I could not have put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. So there's the anarchy at work here. Powerful stuff, huh? So, again, I would highly recommend this book. This is a wonderful book. Clay Jones, Immortal. And it's just so good. I've been doing the chapters that are talking about the failures of people desperately trying to live a life without God. And, of course, we're going to move later to the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because if Jesus rose from the dead, that changes everything, doesn't it? Isn't that wonderful? And so he's got a chapter on that. He's got a chapter on living the high life, enjoying true immortality, why you want to stay alive and stare down death, and then real immortality later on, the resurrection. So this is a good book. I highly recommend it to all of you. And thank you so much for being part of this podcast, and I'll be with you next time.